Okay. There's a doggy munching on some food, so you may hear some munching in the background for a few minutes. So this specific topic has come up actually, I think today, this morning was the third time, maybe fourth time in the last week or something like that. So it's like, okay, I guess maybe it's time for a video about it. And I will do my best to, you know, speak to this from my own experience with it. And there's kind of two sides to this. One being, it's a thirsty lady. One being, things are as they are. Things are as they are. And the other aspect of that being equanimity, like true equanimity versus bypassing. And this is a really fun one. And I say that it's fun because it's something that I fell into super fucking hard. Fell into this trap of bypassing, thinking that there was equanimity that was found, and really came to see that that was not the case. And so there's been a really deep mirroring just in, you know, in my own life of, I suppose it would be meeting reactivity. And, you know, as it relates to equanimity and bypassing, so I heard a lot, you know, I had, you know, listened to a number of teachings and, you know, things regarding equanimity and true equanimity. And there was a lot of confusion for me in that. So what I thought equanimity was just being like, oh, that's not true. There's a thought, that's not true. There's an emotion, that's not true. And that's kind of just the first layer of it. All right, snack time is over. So the you know, just seeing an emotion or seeing a thought and jumping to that's not true is just a layer, like a first layer, digging down into true equanimity. And true equanimity is directly contacting things as they are. Not just things externally as they are, but things, energies arising internally, and meeting them as they are. And meeting them means feeling them. And so the subtlety and the nuance here is that what happened for me, and what seems really common, which is what I've noticed in others, is a tendency to hold, especially the thing, so hold something away and not meet it directly. And we do that particularly, or I did that particularly with uncomfortable sensations, with challenging emotions. And I want to, you know, just make a quick, I guess, kind of distinction. So when I speak about emotions, kind of what I'm referring to is emotions are really just a sensation. Like it's a sensation or an energetic kind of texture that's arising, and it's, you know, there's a label that we put on top of that, of anger, sadness, grief, joy, happiness. So emotion is just like a labeling, like a thought overlay, a labeling over the top of a sensation that's arising, something that simply is. And to simply say that, oh, that's not true, is still a subtle, it may feel subtle, but at one point it's like, oh, that's very, very overt. It's a pushing away of things as they are. It's holding something at arm's length because there's been such a deep pattern created around avoidance of directly contacting sensation, particularly really uncomfortable sensations. I know for me, anger has been like a monumental one, because there was such, there's just like all of these ways that, like, growing up as children, we see anger manifesting in different ways. So we see anger manifesting as rage or violence or criticality or control, or like all these like either small or big ways that anger manifests, violence. And so we become, especially as small children, and especially if that anger is projected, being channeled towards us, that's terrifying. That's a terrifying energy to be on the receiving end of. So what we unconsciously do is we start to hold that sensation in our own selves at arm's length, and we create an identity around, like, it's not okay to feel that, it's not safe to feel that. And so an identity unconsciously gets built up around holding a sensation at arm's length. And in the bypassing is engaging in the push-pull. So either, say like the sensation that we associate with anger, which can be like a really powerful and like fiery sensation. We either take it and point it at something externally and say, like, this is because of you, something like that. Or internally, we push it away because we're afraid of feeling that in ourselves. And it's probably some combination of these two things. At least I know it has been for me, of like maybe doing that with the anger and then feeling like a sense of shame because it's directly challenging this like identity that's been built up, or this like belief that like it's not okay to feel that, because at one point maybe it wasn't. So there's this like nuance here, and the bypassing, like that, both of those things, one is kind of holding the energy, like, grabbing onto it, and then feeding it and giving it fuel, I suppose. And then the other is distancing, and both are creating a sense of separation. So this is separation because it's holding it away. It's like, I am not that thing. And this is feeding separation, this movement, because there's an identification. Let's see, how do I want to say this? Because oftentimes when we pick it up and there's a projecting outwards, like onto something external, that it's because of something outside of us. And so in both cases, there's a division. There's separation that naturally happens. And equanimity is the collapsing of that division. And instead of holding it away or it's a, so you maybe like in meditation perhaps have heard of this concept of like finding the gap. So, and we often hear about this like in thoughts. So if you like start to pay attention to thoughts, you start to notice that there's gap between thoughts, and you come to rest in that gap, and the gap eventually kind of gets wider and wider. And so the same thing can happen with that, with dropping into sensation and with contacting sensation is what we notice is that there's a gap between a sensation arising and then either this movement or that. I feel like that's silly faces. So there's a gap that happens. They're not, it doesn't happen right at the same time. There's this gap in there. And it's coming to find that gap and resting in the gap. So it's like feeling the sensation bubble up. And there's, the tendency to push it away or blah, because there's like, with this one, there's like a release or a temporary, I guess, quelling of the sensation that happens. And then with this one, there can be like an avoidance of it. So in both cases, it's in just different ways, it's kind of an avoidance of the direct contact with the sensation itself. But that equanimity happens when we find the gap. And so you feel the sensation. And what I found is learning to notice like, oh, there's this sensation coming up. And this sounds paradoxical, but it's not. So it's simultaneously contacting the sensation, but not touching it with identity, not touching the identification with it. So it's contacting it, which is feeling it. And it's fucking uncomfortable sometimes, at least it has been for me, especially with like really powerful emotions like anger, really fucking uncomfortable to make direct contact with it, but then not touching it. So not doing this and not just pausing in that gap and feeling, this is a really important bit, feeling the sensation. So it's contacting the sensation. And you might notice, like I've noticed, that there's this, there can be a really strong impulse, a habituated impulse to, once that sensation is contacted, there's like this pinging back up into thought. So there's maybe like a thought about the sensation or labeling it as an emotion, or like who's responsible for the fact that this is coming up, or like what circumstance you might be frustrated with that's causing this sensation. There's a train coming. Train. I'll pause at least until the engine goes by. Those are usually the loudest part. So the contacting of the sensation, that's where equanimity really happens. The reactivity is responding to the sensation, and the response is either the push or the pull. The woo. You almost, I just did that, and I just had this image of like a basketball. So it's like somebody throws you a basketball, and the bypassing is either, literally it's passing, either tossing it away to somebody else or like pushing it away, maybe like tossing it to somebody else, or like throwing it, jump shot. I don't know anything about sports, so that might be a terrible metaphor. I just realized like the sports metaphor was not the metaphor I should have gone with. Anyways, or you can just stand and hold it and feel the texture of the ball in your hands. Feel the pressure, like the firmness, like notice the qualities of it. You don't have to do anything with it though. And that's the true equanimity, is directly contacting sensation. And anger has been such a hard one for me. It's taken me quite a while to figure that out, because especially I think in our culture, like many of us, we don't even have context for how to begin to make contact with those sensations, and there's these like strong beliefs and wounding around how we've seen those energies manifest, that there's a really deep fear of feeling it in ourselves, because there's an association with like, well, if I feel this, I could really hurt somebody, I could really do a lot of harm, and so we push it away. But the liberation of it, of those energies, is the direct contacting of them and allowing things to be as they are. Things are as they are. I think I heard Mukti say that, and it just like really stuck with me. Things are as they are. And just giving whatever is arising, because in a moment, like perhaps, you know, a sensation that we label anger, like that's just what is. And giving that permission and space to be as it is and to contact it. And so this doesn't mean, I want to be clear about this, so this doesn't mean that nothing ever happens, or that you never, that anger never actually expresses, because it likely will. I don't know if these energies, like at least in a kind of human way of engaging in the world, are kind of guideposts. So anger can be a guidepost for a boundary that's wanting to be set. So it doesn't, making contact and finding that equanimity does not equate to kind of rolling over and becoming a doormat. That's not what that is. But it's like kind of it's learning to notice either the conditioning to bleh or to, and instead pausing and feeling it. And in that pausing and feeling it, and confronting it, contacting it, there's going to be a challenging of identity that happens. You're going to very clearly see what identity the train stopped, what identity is wanting to do with it, how identity is wanting to pick it up and either run with it or throw it away as quickly as possible. And that's showing the stuck places. So there's this way to start to work with reactivity and to find the gap. And in that gap too, there may be like, may want to express as an emotion. So there may be like, maybe sitting, you know, I've had this a number of times, but just like sitting in that gap with a sensation of anger, and it turns out that what's actually wanting to happen is like an expression of grief, you know, tears, like a huge emotional release, is maybe how that energy is liberated. And I really like to kind of tie this stuff in, because I think for some people this can provide interesting context if you do have personal experience with psychedelics, and particularly something like ayahuasca, where that medicine has a purgative effect. So if you have experienced sat with ayahuasca in a ceremony, the way that those releases happen, or like those energies get liberated, is often through a purging. So there's like a cycle that's being complete. And so for some, it's just with ayahuasca in particular, it can be vomiting, diarrhea, sweating, shaking, crying, burping. There's all of these ways that, like an extreme heat or chills, there's like all these ways that texture, that energetic stamp can find its liberation through this like physical thing. And so it's really quite similar. So that doesn't always happen. Like sometimes just the contacting of the energetic texture is enough, and sometimes there is a physical release that happens. And so that can just provide a little bit of context, like if you do have an experience with a big energy moving through in that type of space, and you know what it feels like for, you know, an energy to kind of liberate itself. That can give you some context for how to work with reactivity, or kind of how to contact those energies and allow their liberation, you know, because it happens through many ways. It can be like a kundalini kind of thing, shaking. It can be, you know, nausea, or like feeling contractions in the body, or burping, you know, like there's all sorts of ways. Emotional releases, crying, laughing, you know, there's all sorts of ways that can come through. But it's providing the space for that contact to happen. Like that's where the equanimity arises. It's not touching it, not identifying with it one way or another. And again, that doesn't mean that you're never going to set a boundary or stick up for yourself. Like that's not what that means at all. And it feels like a paradox. Like, how do I not touch it? And how can it be possible to not touch it but then sometimes still express? And that's one of those paradoxes that I found resolved itself just through direct experience of it. Like, it's hard to really explain that, but like experiencing, coming to know it directly, like the paradox resolves itself, and it makes perfect sense how those two things can happen simultaneously or together. So this is a tricky one to work with, because for a long time I had convinced myself that there was equanimity here, that I was equanimous, that, you know, but what was really happening was a pushing away, because I didn't want to feel those things directly. Because when you start to confront and make contact with those sensations, there's like deep shadows that come out. There's deep wounding and like old stories and patterns and beliefs and trauma. Like it kind of just comes out. It comes to the surface. It's all of the ways that we've been holding things as they are at arm's length, because maybe at one point there just like wasn't the freedom for them to express, so they stay stuck and then just kind of loop and surface, almost like little what am I thinking of, like the whack-a-moles. It's like whack-a-moles. It just keeps boop 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 boop, and then we're going to spend all this energy trying to shove it back down instead of contacting it and allowing it to move through and move up and out, move through the system and liberate itself. And then there doesn't need to be an identification. It's the identification with it that drops and that causes that push-pull. But there can still be a response to an energy without identifying with it. Like, it's not me that's angry. It's not me that's holding anger away or manifesting anger. It's just anger. And can be really challenging. It's been really challenging for me. Like those really hard emotions, like anger and like heartbreak. And it doesn't have to be heartbreak from like a romantic relationship. Heartbreak from losing a parent or a sibling, or losing a friend, or some sort of big loss, losing like a central piece of the way that you identify in the world. It can be anything, any number of things. Losing some central piece of how you see yourself, how the self is constructed. There can be a big grief in that. And those big ones are the ones that are, at least for me, and what I find engaging with people, is that there's the most resistance to, because they're very vulnerable. They're very vulnerable. There's a feeling of feeling totally out of control. But as things have always been out of control, it's just contacting the complete out of control nature of life. That nothing is in control. Things simply are as they are. That's like dying into the void, into the unknown, into the mystery. And it's coming to realize that, like, I don't actually know anything. There's nothing that I know. And that's part of, like, contacting those things directly, is having to let go of control and of knowing what might happen or what might come of it. It's putting all the cards on the table, putting all your cards on the table. I think 25 minutes is good for a video, but the last thing I'll say is that it was really helpful for me to have support in working through this. So whether that be through a therapist or somebody that has been through it, or doing somatic practices like nervous system regulation, like that's been a huge part of it for me, is various nervous system practices. I think those can all be really supportive in contacting those sensations, and having somebody else as like a grounding rod to kind of help ground the energy as you make that contact can be really, really nice, really essential. Not necessary, not particularly necessary for everyone, but for some can be really essential, especially if there wasn't the permission for it. It can be really nice to have a space and like a grounding rod where there is permission for it, where there's not a judgment of it, and that identity can be confronted on multiple levels, not just in your own contact of it, but in another witnessing it, and for it to totally be okay. So equanimity versus bypassing, it's a slippery one, and just it takes a deep humility to acknowledge and be honest enough with yourself to realize that, like, oh, there's actually still bypassing happening, and having the courage to lean into making that contact.